Thank you so much for being here and for that fabulous workshop you taught for us, for our community a couple of weeks ago. I've been a fan of your work for a very, very long time. And I guess it was last year I heard phase one, and I was walking, it was during that pandemic walking time where I was like really good about getting up and just like walking around the neighborhood. And I listened to Pádraig Ó Tuama read that poem, and it resonated so much. And I'm sure you've heard this a lot from a lot of people. And every time I've taught it, and when I say taught it, really, I've learned from it with a group of people, which is what my teaching tends to be. It's been so wildly opening and permission granting for people. And I find that in your work, you have this sort of really surreal, like spiritual thread that runs through it. That I was really curious about your religious upbringing. And
yeah, no, it's a great question. I had my copy up here, but so Kazim Ali just edited an anthology of contemporary writing by North American Muslims, and I have work in it. And I really feel at home in that anthology because Kazim's introduction is so gorgeous and so inclusive, meaning he describes this anthology as being full of good Muslims, bad Muslims, Muslims who are, like of every stripe. And so for me, I have to admit, when I looked at my manuscript, it was sort of like, there's an awful lot of God in here. Like, where did that come from? Because I wasn't necessarily raised with a kind of religious community at all, especially in those small towns in Ohio. It was sort of like we would sort of drive to religion. It was like, we're going to go to Eid now. Everybody, wake up, get ready, put on your fancy stuff, and we would just go house hop, and there was very little connection to what was happening in terms of the actual religion. So when I see all the God showing up in my poems, I'm actually sort of taken aback. But I think a big part of that comes out of having to grapple with end of life and mortality for family member, all those things. That's really, that was sort of in the vortex around that phase of life. But in terms of my upbringing, we were very disconnected from Islam. And even though my parents identified very strongly as like that's their religion, we didn't have that connection. So it was really just kind of sporadic ties to Islam as a religion, and the knowledge that our parents, identified as such. But really for our family, it was much more cultural than anything else. It was related to family and friends and food. And there was very little, very little that I think had to do with like actual teachings of Islam. So I think, as I mentioned, I think all that spiritual questioning came out of just the time and the struggles that my family was going through while my dad was sick. So it's shocking to me when I look at it. It was shocking.
Isn't it? Yeah. I mean, I think like that's one of the greatest gifts that we give ourselves as writers, is like discovering like, oh, this is the shit I'm thinking about. And finding it on the page, and then making sometimes the decision to erase it from the page and be like, oh, this is here, or like to lean into it and be like, okay, this is a clue. And I'm going to just be brave about like leaning into the questions. And I think growing up, in America in the 80s and 90s, there hadn't been like a lot of space for questioning, right? Like it was a kind of a cynical time. Right. I feel like it's a little more, people are like questioning authority in a different way right now. Like I see my kids, I have a teenage son and a 21-year-old son and some nieces who are the same, sort of in that range. And they're questioning more earnestly in some ways than I think we were maybe encouraged to do, or our peers allowed us to do. Poetry is such an earnest endeavor at its best. How did you come to it?
It's a great question. So I've tried to track it and figure it out myself. And it seems like there are a couple of different things at play. One is that I grew up in a literature loving household. So both of my parents loved poetry. Of course, the poetry they were reading and appreciating was Bangladeshi or in Bangla. And I don't read Bangla and I speak it poorly, but it was my first language. So, when I was growing up, my mom would read Bengali poetry to me and translate it from like the formal Bangla into everyday, household Bangla that I could understand. So there was that. And then I had two older sisters who were always, bringing home whatever books they were reading for high school or, middle school and college. And I just ate up everything they brought home, especially their lit books. And they were both interested in writing and they encouraged me too. So I was lucky in that way that they were like, I was writing horrible stuff or just really, even when I was a kid, I was writing, and they were always very sweet and supportive about it. I think that's why I was drawn to it. And then because we moved so many times, I had this very steady letter writing practice where, like every town I left, there were like a handful of friends I corresponded with. And some of those went from, third grade all the way till college. So there was always this feeling of like using language to communicate something important. There was no internet, there's no email, and so letter writing was like that, and journaling and keeping a diary were two big forms of writing for me. But it wasn't until I got to two things then happened. One is that I moved in ninth grade, at the beginning of ninth grade, from a town I really loved with a friend circle I adored. And when we moved, I was devastated. We moved to this tiny town in north of Pittsburgh, and I really felt so much more out of place than I had when I first arrived in the previous town, which was more of like a college town and just a little bit more diverse and open-minded. So I started filling notebooks with this horrible, angst-ridden poetry. And, but I saw poetry as like, that's what I was doing. It wasn't a letter. It wasn't just a journal entry. It wasn't fiction. It wasn't nonfiction. It was poetry. Yeah. So there was that. And then when I got to college, I was still interested in it. And it wasn't until then that I realized like, oh, like you can actually learn things, like you can acquire tools to do a better job with what I was attempting to do. So that was kind of eye-opening for me early on.
Yeah. I wondered about any rituals you have to get into. So you're a parent?
Yes. Yeah. I have a middle schooler and a second grader.
Okay. And there's like always something you could be doing for them.
Oh yeah.
With kids, right? Right. There's like always like somebody needs a sandwich or laundry or a sock found or and I find that has been a really helpful tool for procrastination for me when I'm like writing something hard or not wanting to write. And then on the other hand, so I have to create some systems for like, no, you're not going to live in service to other people in order to avoid your own brain. Right. How do you, and you're like pretty prolific. You teach in a lot of places. And of course, you're parenting. How do you make time for that messy, discovering God on the page kind of stuff?
Right. Does that happen while I make sandwiches? Sometimes.
Right.
Yeah. But yeah, I know. I think that's so beautifully put. Like, how do you create parameters so that you're not living your life in service to avoid working on sitting with the empty page?
Yeah.
I think there is a way in which all the things that are necessary as, in a part of raising a family become a kind of productive distraction where it's like, oh, well, surely I have to prioritize this, this, and this. And then it's harder to say like, well, this thing that has no tangible outcome for anybody else, I'm going to prioritize that now. Right. For me, it feels weird. And I think that's true for a lot of people. So it's funny, before I became a parent, I would need long blocks of time to write. It was like, it has to be quiet, at one point, my husband and I were living in a very small apartment on the West Coast. We lived in the Bay Area. And what I didn't realize was that it was really disruptive to have anybody in the room, but the apartment was set up in a way where like he couldn't get to the sink to get water while I was reading. So it took me some time to figure out like, oh, I really need to be by myself. And it has to be totally quiet in any of these like glorious 2-hour chunks of time to get the work done. And then I had my first kid, right? So then sort of like, all right, I have 20 minutes. And in that time, I could either take a shower, brush my teeth, fold laundry, start a new load, or write something, like those are the choices in front of me. And so I had to figure out, how to address some of those within those little moments of time happening during the nap. And I think that changed everything for me in terms of how I went about writing. It was no longer like, oh, I have to have this big, long stretch of writing in order to get into the mind space to write. It just sort of intensified things in a way where it was like, all right, I have 10 minutes, like, let's go, and that's not how I could do it before. So
and what does it mean? What does let's go look like then in that 10 minutes?
Let's go can look like, like, I don't know what to write about. I feel stuck, but I have this window of opportunity. So I go back to one of the prompts from one of my mentors in grad school, Martha Rhodes, who basically said, like, if you're stuck, open a book, put your hand down, write down the 5 words your fingertips are touching, and, maybe accumulate 10 words and then set a timer for 10 minutes and go. So that's still my go-to strategy when I'm feeling stuck, because so often the feeling of being stuck is related to perfectionism, where it's sort of like, oh, I have this polished poem over here, but like clearly that's never going to happen again. So, like I'm afraid to put anything down on the page. So, I think that just trying to keep the work messy in terms of drafts, using prompts if I'm feeling stuck, that's basically what let's go looks like. It's sort of like generating some messy material, not thinking hard about what it is or if it's any good, which, usually it's not, but at least it's a start.
You write by hand or?
I used to write by hand. And I love the feeling of it, but now I feel like my handwriting is so awful and it's so much slower that I don't do that anymore. But I used to write by hand. And then when I felt like the poem was getting somewhere, I would type it up. And then I would print it out and then make, edits by hand again. All of that's been, changed because of the convenience of just starting a rough draft on the computer. But I do try to keep things messy looking, because I find personally, once I have things in a font, sort of like looking really tidy and polished on the page, just in a surface way, then I have a really hard time going back in and just rethinking radically, like, what else could this poem be doing? What are some changes I could make to strengthen it? It gets this like superficial crystallization, where it's sort of like, I'm done-ish, like, I don't know where to go with this one anymore.
Right. I want to kind of come back to something you said about that feeling when you've polished a poem or when you've written something that you're really proud of, and the other like flip side of it being like, I'll never do that again, right. Which is like, because in my experience, so often when you write something, the poet Dare Williams said, it's like when there's a spotlight on your page and it's rare and it happens and you're lucky when it happens. And also it like doesn't happen often. And that's not most of writing, is not that. And I mean, like you've received so many accolades and awards for your writing. How has that, how have you, I'm not sure exactly what my question is, but there's sort of something around like how you navigate putting that away. Yeah. And you talked about the prompt, but.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, because when I wrote my first book, I didn't really know I was writing a book. I was exploring different questions that I had and just kind of, like pawing through darkness, trying to figure some things out, mostly for myself. And also to kind of speak back to, like, at that time, there wasn't this amazing flood of writings by first generation immigrant writers, and particularly South Asian writers, female, South Asian writers. So I was sort of like speaking back to this absence that I perceived when I walked into a library. And thankfully that's changed dramatically. But when the second book was coming out, it felt different in terms of like, okay, I've had some poems out in the world now. And I do think in many ways it put a kind of pressure on me that made me nervous about like, some people really like the idea of developing a voice, like they wanted a consistent voice, and other people like the idea of like, really radically trying something new. And I didn't know which would happen for me. I personally tend to think like, I kind of like to push back on the idea of a voice. I like to think of being more almost like a vessel, where it's sort of like, how flexible and dynamic can my writing practice be to express whatever it is I'm trying to convey, rather than trying to like hone in on a very particular style. But then it's sort of like, well, what does that mean? You know, how does that look on the page? I don't know. I can certainly try to experiment with a lot of different things. But yeah, there was definitely a sense of pressure around the writing that was different from the first time, where I was more alert and aware, alert to and aware of the idea of audience. That was a distraction. You know, it was really distracting and could, be manifest in ways that were basically like writer's block. But what happened in the end with that second book is that, I had some things I was working on prior to the onset of his illness. And, I still don't think that work is headed anywhere, but I was writing a lot. And then when he got sick, I continued writing, but I didn't want to write about the things that were right in front of me. So I tried to keep, writing these other things, but it was sort of like, none of it was authentic. None of it was, felt fruitful. And so it was just kind of skirting the issues that mattered, like skirting the material that was in me that really mattered. And so, sometimes that did end up looking like writer's block, where it was like, I don't want to write about this, that's right in front of my face. But this other stuff is sort of like, it's not going anywhere. But in the end, what happened is that the family schedule was just kind of turned upside down, and the writing, there were periods of time where it wasn't happening at all, and it just wasn't a priority. It wasn't something that was on my radar. I knew it would happen at some point, but it wasn't going to happen in a certain period of time. And so I just had to honor that, and just kind of let go of the idea of it. And then, got to the point where I felt like there were things welling up in me that I wanted to write about, but I still couldn't do it. I couldn't get access to it. So it wasn't actually until about a year after his death that, after my father's death, that something in me just dissolved. And then I wrote a lot. I just wrote a ton of poems after not having written much, that I felt had energy behind it for a long time. And then, a bunch of poems came out, and I felt like, wow, I'm just writing about the same thing over and over and over again. So another tactic for me was to just, try different strategies, because the material was overwhelming, and intense. So I had to figure out, like, how do I get at this and get at it in a different way, and not just kind of like keep doing the same thing over and over again. So that's sort of how things unfolded with the second book.
So beautiful. So much you said there is just like so essential. And I wanted to pull a couple of threads. One being the importance of giving yourself the space to not write about the hardest thing. Like, even though it's frustrating and, like, I could just like take at this thing, this open wound for the sake of the work, but like, no, our work is to live.
Right.
And that was really beautiful. And then when it dissolves and you can arrive to it, it's such a beautiful thing. It's such a beautiful lesson to give emerging writers, like, because there can be this real pressure of like, I have to mind my darkness again and again and again and again. And that is the value. That is my value as an artist, is to just like flay myself open. And that's not a sustainable practice.
Right.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah, I think that's a real aspect of self-care, Seema, what you're describing. Like, many times when we do that flaying open, like, we are not really always paying attention to the self-care aspect of it. Like, where do you go with yourself after you've done that flaying, right? How do you re-enter the normal day? So I think, part of it is knowing when you can, right? When and how you can sort of go there, and then how to transition out of it in a way that doesn't feel like you can't, like it's just too much, overwhelming. So yeah, I think part of the self-care is just honoring the periods that feel like they're fallow but aren't, and honoring, silence, and just, being willing to let it go and not put pressure on it.
Yeah, beautiful. John Sands writes in his poem, It's a Lot, which is also in the anthology. I mean, the poems in this anthology, I'm super excited. that it's a lot to not become a caricature of your sadnesses,
Mhm.
right? And that's sort of the other side of it too, where I think it really relates to, and as I was like reviewing your work in preparation to speak to you, I did notice that your voice is not one thing. You have this range, which gives you space too to look at maybe sometimes the same thing from a different angle. But there is so much pressure to have a voice, right? To have a poem that is, like for your poems to be recognizable as your poems and it's like pretty common advice. How did you flout that? Like, how did you decide, like, F that, or was it conscious?
Well, I think in the case of this book, it was more of a necessity because I was driving myself crazy. It was sort of like, how much more could I write about this material? But that was what was in the well, sort of like, that's what I keep going back to because it's there. That's what's right in front of me. So I needed other strategies to get at it, just even for my own sake to, where I was sort of like, I'm exhausted of these poems. They're exhausting. They're so emotionally exhausting. And yet here we go again, right? So I think even just trying out different formal strategies like a guzzle or whatever it was more of like a distraction for me or a coping mechanism for me. But I did have this idea that, like when I would hear people say these things about voice, or I had young writers coming to me and saying like, I really want to establish my voice. I think just personally, I'm stubborn, so whenever I hear a kind of poetry rule of any kind, I immediately think like, okay, yeah, but I'm not so sure about that. So, for every time in class that I say like, you want to really focus on sensory detail and, think hard about how you use abstraction. And I always think there must be poems out there that just entirely use abstraction that are kick-ass. And I just haven't seen them, it just depends on how it's functioning in the poem. So I have a kind of stubbornness, I think, within me about that. And so when I heard these younger writers talking about voice, I was like, is that really what we want? We want to just settle into a groove and then become who we are going to become and stay that way. It just sounded, I guess, boring in a way, sort of like, that's not exciting to me. And so I like to think about that first album that Regina Spektor did, where like every song was really different. Like she had songs that were a little on the punk side and kind of rock and roll, and then these ballads, and one that sounds like a Russian march, like it's really very diverse. And I thought that was so interesting. So I think more than anything, I'm just curious about a lot of stuff and probably, easily bored. And so for me, it's exciting to just try out new things. And I do think it helps me kind of approach my work in ways that I wouldn't, there are discoveries or surprises to myself that I wouldn't have gotten to if I just kept kind of going the same path.
That's beautiful. And curious was on the tip of my tongue, but before you said it, I was going to say, like, there's an active wonder in your work. Like, it's clearly there on the page that you're like, you're having fun. It seems you're the material is heavy, you're being playful, and it's really extraordinary to read, and it's a gift to all of us. And so I'm grateful for your work and for your contribution. I asked folks for poems for the anthology and didn't necessarily sort of explain it all. But what we have is the poems that inspired us and the poems they inspired next to each other. Amazing. So we'll have poems written. We have many poems written in response to phase one that are in the book, and we'll have a reader respond to your work directly, which I think will be really beautiful and special. And the whole, for me, magic of poetry is the way that it leaves space for people to come up with their own ideas and to mine their own lives. Right. So thank you for that.
That's amazing. Thank you for using my poem. You mentioned, that you wondered about whether I'd received a lot of responses like that. And I do think that more than any other poem that I've written, and because I was fortunate that Pádraig Ó Tuama chose my poem for that podcast that has a wide listenership, I've gotten more personal notes from that poem than anything else that I've written. And I think, the other part of it is that it was a poem where I was, sort of in a mode of being brutally honest. And I had one young writer ask me, like, how did you decide where to draw the line? Like which things you would keep in the poem and which ones you would leave out. And I think in the end, it was just that the things that ended up on the page felt authentic and true. It was sort of like, that's what feels authentic and true. And I'm not willing to just kind of like erase it. And I think that might be part of what people are responding to. It's sort of like, these things that we might not want to say out loud about ourselves, and then have it in this litany, where it's like, oh, like this doesn't stop, this list keeps going. And I actually had a friend, you were asking like, what are some of the things that keep me going? I have a good friend from graduate school with whom I exchange poems every week. So it's on the calendar. And that's one of the things that keeps me going in the midst of a very full schedule. It's sort of like, we know that expectation is there, even if we have to cancel or shorten it or whatever. But he actually helped me revise that poem so that I could think about a kind of like almost like a seismograph in terms of like, what's the level of transgression for each one of those things, so that I could kind of modulate, the tension throughout. Because, one of the worst things in there is the moment about treating her mother with contempt when she deserved compassion. And in earlier versions of that poem, that came a little bit earlier. And this good friend of mine from grad school was like, you could probably have a different kind of effect if you built up to that. And so I'm really indebted to him for those comments, because the poem was really different in earlier forms. It's much messier. And, longer.
But the thing it really, in my read of it, really builds to is this idea of forgiveness in an abundance, the abundance of forgiveness, like an imagining of a world in which forgiveness is abundant, which of course then means transgressions are abundant too, right? They're tied together. And I loved this idea of free forgiveness, just raining down. How did you, and maybe there isn't an answer, but how did you come to those images of forgiveness, just like, almost being us all being weighed down by a rain of forgiveness?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, so that one actually came out of the 2016 election, because what happened was that, I grew up in small towns where most of the people I went to high school with were from families who were Republican, and the town where I went to high school, I had friends tell me like, oh, my grandparents were part of the KKK. Everyone was. It was like the Rotary Club. So, like this is the context of some of my upbringing. And so, I'm in touch with some of those people, those early friendships. And what I realized after the election was that I was carrying a lot of anger around, and it was very toxic. And it wasn't just about like general anger about what I was seeing on the news or things I knew about our country, but it was also directed toward people I knew. And that was starting to feel like a huge burden. And it was really black, just really toxic. So I had to I felt like I had to figure out for myself, like, where do I take this? Am I just going to be angry for a long, long time? And what does that mean? So two things happened. One was that I started doing a little reading about like, ideas around empathy and compassion, and trying to figure out like, how do we even get there with the country being the way it is, with our relationships being the way they are. And the other thing is that I started pouring energy into local organizing so that I could feel like, all right, regardless of what's happening in my writing, I'm doing these concrete things at a local level to help at least, hopefully bring about some change. So there was that local activism going on. And then through my writing, trying to figure out, what am I going to do about all this anger I'm carrying around that's getting really toxic? So one of the things I read that really resonated with me was the idea of our forgiveness for others, starting with forgiveness within. And that felt really authentic to me, because even the idea of forgiveness towards others, it's sort of like, who grants that? Who can grant that? Under what circumstances? Is it even warranted? Like that, there's a lot of stuff around that that's unresolved.
What even is it?
What even is it? Right, exactly. So there were too many questions around that. The idea of looking within and just starting to think about like, what are the rifts and divisions within me that are not healed yet? And how do I release myself of those? Or how do I heal from those? That as a first step to like anything, any kind of healing felt really authentic. And so it made sense to me to just look inward in that way, even though everything I was thinking about and wanting to do was out here, right, externally. So it was, it came about through my attempts to do that deep inward looking and like, all right, what's going on inside? What are the things I'm holding on to? And there are definitely things that didn't make it into the poem that are, sort of unspoken and hovering over the page that I didn't end up putting in. But I feel like in terms of the tone and the emotional sort of mood of the poem, that I was, I dug deeper than I normally would in a poem that is kind of like revealing a lot about myself. And then it just, it rang true on the page and I thought, I think I have to leave it here. So that's kind of how that came about.
Beautiful. Yes. That, I have some people who I have known in my own life who have these sorts of points of view. And I feel personally hurt. Like, in addition to being angry on this meta, like what is happening to the world, I also am like, but don't you understand that this is hurting your pal Seema? Like, right? Like, and that's, yeah. And so that abundance of that was what really striking to me.
Yeah. It's hard to grapple with that and then to figure out, okay, what does it mean for my relationship with these people? I think also in my case, these were in some cases friends who didn't realize they had voted against themselves and their own family members. They didn't understand the very specific ways in which that was happening, whether that was related to, their family's background, their family members' gender identity. There were all kinds of things that they were voting within their own family. And so in a way it was like, it was maddening to think about these individual peoples in addition to all the general anger about what was going on. So I needed a way out of it. I had to figure out how to get to the other side of it.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that poem and for all your work and for being a part of the United Against Silence Collective. We're so grateful to have you.